Imagine being just 12 years old enough to learn math but not old enough to understand death. Yet in the final desperate months of World War II, Germany pushed over 200,000 boys into the battlefield. Some were so small that Allied soldiers lowered their rifles the moment they saw their faces. Tonight, we uncover the shocking truth behind one of the war's darkest chapters: the rise, collapse, and tragic exploitation of Hitler's child soldiers. By the winter of 1944, the Third Reich that had once seemed unstoppable was collapsing from within. The grand promises of a 1,000-year empire had dissolved into a nightmare of burning cities and frozen corpses. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces were pushing westward with overwhelming force. In the West, Allied armies had liberated France and were advancing toward the Rhine. Germany's professional army, once the most feared military machine in Europe, was bleeding out. The numbers told a devastating story. At Stalingrad alone, Germany had lost an entire army, 300,000 men dead, wounded, or captured. The battles in Normandy, the retreat from the east, the Allied bombing campaigns, each day brought fresh catastrophes. By early 1945, Germany was losing the equivalent of an entire division every week. Experienced officers were dead. Veteran soldiers were gone. The military was running out of men. In the bunkers beneath Berlin, Nazi leadership faced an impossible reality. They could see the end approaching. But rather than surrender, rather than spare what remained of their nation, they made a decision that would haunt history. They would send children to hold the line. The Hitler Youth had begun as something different, a youth organization designed to mold young Germans into loyal Nazis through camping trips, sports, and ideological education. By 1939, membership was mandatory for all German boys aged 10 and up. They wore uniforms. They marched in formation. They learned to idolize the Führer and dream of military glory. But as the war turned against Germany, the Hitler Youth transformed. Training exercises became more militaristic. Boys practiced with real weapons. They dug trenches and learned urban warfare tactics. The propaganda intensified: duty, sacrifice, heroism. Every boy was told he was Germany's last hope, that his courage could turn the tide, that dying for the fatherland was the highest honor imaginable. The children believed it. They had known nothing else. Many had grown up under Nazi rule, had been shaped by it from their earliest memories. They saw the propaganda films showing heroic German victories. They heard the speeches promising that secret weapons would save them. They trusted their leaders completely. By late 1944, that trust would be weaponized in the cruelest way possible. But what happens when ideology meets reality, when a child trained to salute finds himself holding a rifle larger than his own body? In March 1945, Hitler signed the order creating the Volkssturm, the People's Storm, a last-ditch militia force. The decree was clear. Every male from ages 16 to 60 capable of holding a weapon would be conscripted. But as desperate commanders scoured their districts for bodies, the age limits became suggestions. Soon, boys as young as 12 were being pulled from their homes and schools. Over 200,000 children under 18 were pressed into combat in the final months of the war. They were given minimal training, sometimes just a few days. They were handed obsolete rifles, often World War I-era weapons that jammed in the cold. Some units had only one rifle for every 3 boys. Others were given Panzerfausts, single-shot anti-tank weapons, and told to stop Soviet T-34 tanks. They had no proper winter uniforms. Many wore their Hitler Youth uniforms with an armband added. They lacked food, medical supplies, and ammunition. Most critically, they lacked the one thing that might have kept them alive: experienced adult leadership. Their officers were often elderly Volkssturm members or boys barely older than themselves. Picture a snow-covered trench somewhere outside Berlin in early 1945. Inside huddle half a dozen boys, the oldest maybe 15, the youngest barely 13. Their breath forms clouds in the freezing air. Their hands shake, not from the cold but from terror so profound their bodies won't obey them. They can hear the rumble before they see it. Soviet artillery in the distance, then closer, then impossibly close. The earth shakes. Snow cascades from the trench walls. One boy is crying silently, tears freezing on his cheeks. Another grips his rifle so tightly his fingers have gone white. A third stares straight ahead, dissociating completely, retreating somewhere inside himself where the war can't reach. Then the tanks appear. Massive, unstoppable, their treads grinding through everything in their path. The boys have been told to wait, to let the tanks get close, to aim for the weak spots. But every instinct screams at them to run. Some do. Others freeze completely. A few, driven by propaganda or pure survival instinct, actually try to fight. It's slaughter. Not a battle, slaughter. These children have no chance. In the final battle for Berlin, child soldiers became a common sight in the rubble-strewn streets. Boys aged 12 to 16 were assigned to defend bridges, intersection points, and government buildings. They were told they were the last line of defense, that Germany's survival depended on their courage. Some believed it so completely that they fought with fanatical determination. There are accounts of Hitler Youth members attacking Soviet tanks with nothing but grenades, running directly at armored vehicles and suicidal charges. Others manned anti-aircraft guns against Soviet fighter planes, staying at their posts even as buildings collapsed around them. Allied soldiers who encountered these child defenders were shocked and often horrified. American and British troops advancing from the west reported entire units refusing to fire on obvious children. Soviet soldiers, hardened by years of brutal warfare, found themselves facing 13-year-olds and struggling with the moral impossibility of the situation. One American lieutenant later wrote, "We came around a corner and saw what we thought was a German position. We were ready to fight. Then they stood up to surrender and I realized they were children. Kids. The oldest might have been 16. I had a son back home about the same age. We lowered our weapons. What else could we do?" But the greatest tragedy wasn't the battles they fought. It was the moment they realized the war they had been promised didn't exist. The breaking point came differently for different boys, but it came for nearly all of them. For some, it was seeing their friends die in meaningless skirmishes. For others, it was the moment they looked into the eyes of enemy soldiers and saw not monsters, but tired men who looked at them with pity. Many broke when they realized their leaders had lied. The secret weapons weren't coming. Reinforcements weren't coming. Victory wasn't possible. They had been sent to die not to save Germany, but to delay the inevitable by hours or days while Nazi leadership tried to escape. The scenes of surrender became heartbreaking patterns repeated across Germany. Boys would drop their weapons and simply stand there, tears streaming down their faces, shaking uncontrollably. Some called out for their mothers. Others collapsed completely, their minds unable to process what they had experienced. Most Allied units, when they encountered child soldiers attempting to surrender, responded with compassion rather than vengeance. British and American forces established special collection points for underage prisoners, separating them from adult POWs and treating them more like refugees than combatants. Medical teams worked to treat their wounds, both physical and psychological. Many of these children were suffering from frostbite, malnutrition, and shrapnel wounds. But the invisible wounds were deeper. Medics reported boys who couldn't stop trembling, who woke up screaming, who stared blankly at nothing for hours. Soviet forces, despite having endured the worst of Nazi atrocities, also showed unexpected mercy. There are documented cases of Soviet officers ordering their men not to harm obvious children, of Russian soldiers sharing their rations with captured Hitler Youth members, of medics treating wounded German boys with the same care they gave their own. One Soviet soldier later recalled, "I hated the Nazis. I had every reason to hate them. But when I saw those kids, skinny, scared, some of them younger than my little brother, I couldn't hate them. They were victims too. Different victims than us, but victims." But the war's end wasn't the end of their story. For many, the battlefield was only the beginning of a lifelong struggle. The boys who survived faced a Germany in ruins. Cities were rubble. Families were scattered or dead. The entire society that had raised them had collapsed. And they carried wounds that wouldn't heal. Many suffered from what we would now recognize as severe PTSD. They had nightmares that lasted decades. Loud noises would send them into panic attacks. Some couldn't form normal relationships or hold jobs. The psychological trauma of being sent to war as children had fundamentally altered who they were. Physically, many bore permanent scars. Lost limbs. Shrapnel embedded in their bodies. Frostbite damage. Malnutrition that stunted their growth. The war had marked them in ways that would never fully fade. But perhaps the deepest wound was shame. These boys had been indoctrinated to believe they were heroes defending their homeland. As they grew older and learned the full truth about the Nazi regime, the Holocaust, the atrocities, the aggressive wars, many struggled with crushing guilt. They had fought for evil, even if they hadn't understood it at the time. Some hid their past for decades, never speaking about their wartime experiences even to their own families. Others eventually found the courage to share their stories, hoping to warn future generations about the dangers of militarism and propaganda. How did it happen? How were children convinced to march toward certain death? The answer lies in the systematic nature of Nazi indoctrination. These boys had been shaped from early childhood to see themselves as soldiers first and individuals second. They had been taught that questioning authority was weakness, that sacrifice for the state was the highest virtue, that their lives had value only in service to the Führer. Fear played a role too. By 1945, Nazi Germany had become a police state paranoid about internal enemies. Boys who refused to fight could be shot as deserters or traitors. Their families could be punished. In some cases, SS units would execute entire families accused of defeatism. The propaganda had been so effective that even as the war was obviously lost, many boys still believed the lies. They thought victory was possible. They trusted that their leaders knew what they were doing. They couldn't imagine that they were being cynically sacrificed for nothing. This manipulation of young minds stands as one of history's clearest warnings. Children are vulnerable to ideological exploitation in ways that adults are not. Their moral development is incomplete. Their ability to critically evaluate information is limited. When authority figures they trust tell them something, they believe it. Today, historians view the use of child soldiers in Nazi Germany's final months as one of the war's most disturbing chapters. It represents not just a war crime, but a profound betrayal, adults sending children to die to preserve their own power for a few more weeks. The survivors who have spoken publicly emphasize the same message: this must never happen again. In any country, under any ideology, for any reason, children must be protected from war. They are not soldiers. They cannot consent to military service. Using them in combat is not just strategically desperate, it's morally inexcusable. International law now explicitly recognizes this. The optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child forbids the use of soldiers under 18 in hostilities. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court lists recruiting child soldiers as a war crime. These protections exist in part because of what happened in 1945. Yet child soldiers remain a tragic reality in conflicts around the world. Various militias and armies continue to recruit and use children in combat. The lessons of 1945 have not been fully learned. These were not soldiers. They were children, caught between a collapsing regime and a war they never chose. They were manipulated, exploited, and sent to die by adults who should have protected them. Remembering them isn't about reliving the past. It's about understanding how propaganda works, how authority can be abused, and how quickly a society can descend into using its most vulnerable as cannon fodder. It's about safeguarding the future, ensuring that no government, no ideology, no desperate leader ever again looks at a 12-year-old child and sees a soldier. The forgotten children of World War II deserve to be remembered not as combatants, but as victims. Their stories are a warning from history, one we ignore at our peril.